Oh, and it looks like it has officially gone live. Yay! Okay, so this is always the most awkward part. Hello, is it Mishan? Did I say that right? Mishan? I don't know how to pronounce that, but I assume it's right. Mishan, welcome. I will try to welcome people as they come in as best I can. And I do realize, by the way, that it might take a little while for people to enter into the room. Uh, so I'm going to actually stall for a little bit. But Yeah, so last time it took about 3 minutes. So this is surprising, Rashawn. Thank you for showing up literally right on time. That was fast. Did you see did you come through the email through my Substack, or did you find me on live, Mishan? And welcome, RJB. Good to see you here too. I'm glad people are showing up early. Did you see me on the live Substack, the feed, on the notes, or did you get the email out of curiosity? Um, just go ahead and let me know so I kind of have an idea where people are coming from. But I'm going to stall a little bit because last time it took like 3.5 minutes for someone to show up. And that's fine because it takes people time to realize that this is going on. Um, but what I want to do is, to start with, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself that you may not actually know already. And if you do, awesome. But people think of me as sort of the armchair mystic, the armchair radical theologian here. People who get my Substack. But what you might not know is I'm also a modern science-based force-free dog trainer. In fact, that's like my primary job. And um, I started that business, Puppy Tutor Dog Training. By the way, if you're interested, the website is puppytutor.me. I have been in business for 9 years. It's a fantastic job. I love working with people and love working with their dogs. Uh, and Sean, welcome. It's good to see you here. Thank you for showing up. What I'm doing right now is I'm just giving a little bit of introduction to another part of my life that is very important to me. Hello, RJB. Good to see you. And another part of my life is that I am a modern science-based force-free dog trainer. I've been in business for 9 years. My website is puppytutor.me, so I am the puppy tutor. Um, now, I gotta admit, this is kind of like a little bit of a pitch because I work primarily online. When we think about dog trainers, we tend to think about dog trainers like who's near me to actually help me out. But I work primarily online. I personally found that working online is really better than working in people's homes. That's my opinion. I've got a whole article on that if you want to check that out. But I specialize in private lessons, so it's not a group class. The idea is that I want to be able to work with people one on one or one on their family, whoever happens to be on the other end of the call. And I work over Google Meet, so it's effectively the same thing. If I were to work with people in their home, I'm really coaching them more than anything. And so it's effectively the same thing that happens whenever I'm working over Google Meet. The main difference is that when I show people how to do things, I instead of showing them on their dogs, like, hey, come here, Fido, this is what you do, right? Show and then say, you take it from here. What I do instead is I show them on my dogs and then I coach them as they work with their own. It's actually a wonderful job. I enjoy it very much and I have learned a lot. And at one point, I even wanted to write a book when I got Puppy Loki, a theology of dog, how, and it was about growing spiritually with my puppy. So one could argue it's actually better. The private lessons are working online. Oh, because they are because I'm not with them. Absolutely. That's one of the reasons, exactly one of the reasons why I think it's actually better to work with people online rather than being in their home. Because you'd be surprised because when I go there, I think there's an expectation that I'm going to be working with their dog a lot more, and I really don't. But when we work online, um, they got to do it. They got to figure it out, right? Because, spoiler alert is I'm not moving in with them. So they've got to, they can't count on that happening. And so if you're interested in checking out my dog training website, it is puppytutor.me, puppytutor.me. Okay. And it's been about 5 minutes, so I've given some people time to show up. So I want to go ahead and move forward a little bit. But What I'm trying to do with these, I don't know if I call it a presentation or a talk or a rambling or whatever it happens to be, whatever it is I'm doing here in the Substack Live, I'm going to try to keep it to about 10 to 15 minutes worth of content. And the main reason is because I realize that people are busy and it's really difficult for people to sit down and just watch a bobbing head, just blah, 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 blah for however long. And I know that I generally don't have the time for that in my day. And people who have families and things like that, they're not going to have a whole lot of time in their day also. So I'm trying to keep this to a manageable bite size, sort of bite size offer, but not having it so short that there isn't really any substance to it. Um, if you notice, I'm kind of looking off to the side a lot, and that's because I'm using notes. Another bit about me, I tend to be on the scattered side of life. And so if I don't have notes to keep me focused, I'm going to just start stream of consciousness, and we don't even know where we're going to end up. Forget anything like having a point. Yeah. So, but I would encourage you to go ahead and feel free to comment in the chat and say things. I'll try to keep an eye on this as best I can. This is all very new to me, and I will probably completely forget to pay attention because that happens too. Um, and but go ahead and post any thoughts or comments, and I'll try to get to them. If I can't address them at that moment, I'll try to get that to them at the end. Um, and if I don't see it, I apologize. I'll look at them at the very end at least. Now, about that title, and in case you missed it, the title is "The Feminist Jailbreak That Liberated God from Her Patriarchal Prison Cell to Become More Than She Had Ever Been Before." Now, that's a little bit of a provocative title, perhaps. And I think it's going to make more sense when we get to the end. So I encourage you to kind of stick with this. I'm going to have to set up some things here and there, and then I'm going to have to explain, where I'm coming from. And hello, Alex. Thank you for joining. Good to see you here. And so what I'm going to do is hopefully that title will make sense at the end of this. And again, it is "The Feminist Jailbreak That Liberated God from Her Patriarchal Prison Cell to Become More Than She Had Ever Been Before." Okay, so before I can even talk about what all of that means, I think we need to start with patriarchy. What is patriarchy? And now, I think when most people hear the word patriarchy, the first thing that's probably going to come to mind is this idea of a male-dominated hierarchy. Okay, and it's not wrong. It's not wrong at all. In fact, when we think of patriarchy and we think of the past, men have dominated systems in general. Um, But when I think of patriarchy, I'm not really thinking of it as a male dominated hierarchy. I'm actually thinking of any hierarchical domination system. In other words, it's a system in which power flows downhill. Think of it as this: daddy is in charge. Everybody is supposed to obey daddy, and daddy has a responsibility for the health and well being of all those in the family. Okay? That's the basic idea. That's the basic mentality behind the structure. And this is the thing that's really important. Um, well, first of all, I want to say, and it doesn't, by the way, it doesn't have to be men in charge. Okay, it can be women in charge. You can have a matriarchy. A matriarchy is basically exactly the same structure, power flowing downhill. It just has women at the top. So when I'm talking about patriarchy, I'm emphasizing more the arche part than like the patry part. Okay, but basically, here's the thing that's really important in this social structure: the concept of love is entwined with the hierarchy. It is inseparable from this hierarchical structure. Okay. So for those lower down on the social status, they express love upward through deferring to those who are above them. And for those who are higher in the hierarchy, they express love downward through like a paternalistic caring for those below them. Now, this is perhaps most evident in terms of, and like when we look at things like discipline. Okay. So here's the logic of discipline in this system. Um, think about it this way: spanking children. Why in the world would you spank a child, right? You spank a child because they did something wrong and they need to learn a lesson. And learning lessons in life early on when they're children is going to help them later in life. And that's why if you spare the rod, you are going to spoil the child. And so when When daddy says, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, what he's trying to say really is the reason why I'm disciplining you, the reason why I'm behaving violently and acting violence upon your body is because it is an expression of my love for you. Okay. So love is entwined in this. I would really quick note. I am not advocating for any of this. I'm just describing this within the context of the system. Another discipline, another type of discipline that we've seen in patriarchy is this thing called chastisement. Now, chastisement is old. It's no longer part of our lives. It basically, it is where husbands are allowed to beat their wives as long as they didn't leave any permanent marks. Now, again, why do this? To teach a needed lesson because something has gone wrong. And again, chastisement was seen as an expression of love within this hierarchical system. Okay. So patriarchy isn't really about male dominated. It's the ideology behind a hierarchical system where power flows downhill, and it doesn't matter whether you've got men or women at the top. Now, the question is, what has changed? Okay. And I want to look at a couple of movements that happened in the 1800s. First, we've got an anti-slavery movement, and then we've got a pro-woman movement. Now, in the anti-slavery movement, back in seminary, this is about the year 2000. Okay, back in seminary, I was taking a Presbyterian history class, and one of the things we did is we looked at primary source documents. And a primary source document, if you don't know, is a document that someone wrote at the time. So it's like what was happening at the time. They're saying, "This is my life," blah blah blah, and you're reading. It's like you're reading someone's letters. That's a primary source. Okay, and what we were looking at is arguments for and against slavery, and those who supported slavery. Basically, their argument came down to this. The Bible says, and then there it is. They say that it's very clear that the Bible allows and advocates for slavery. The end. The anti-slavery movement, what were they saying? Basically this. Okay, but it's not loving. And Jesus calls us to love our neighbors, and this is not loving at all. And so there's a growing sense that you don't get to treat people that. That's not love. Okay, now, what about the pro-woman movement, if you will? There was a movement that arose to make chastisement illegal. It started in the 1800s. I want to say it was around 1850, and it lasted until about 1920 because it was an uphill fight the whole way. They had to go state by state. Each state had to make it illegal, and I think the last state that made it illegal was around the year 1920. Um, but again, why? Because you don't get to treat people this way. That's not loving. Okay, so we're seeing this kind of pushback in the 1800s. And these kinds of concerns, I argue, are part of what feeds into this thing called postmodernity. Now, postmodernity, the official starting date is around the 1950s. Okay, and to understand postmodernity, I want to talk a little bit about modernity and how it understands how society should be structured and how power flows. So, for modernity, one of the things that we see is there's a strong push towards centralization, strong push toward unification, kind of all being the same, getting everybody on the same page, making everybody kind of all alike, right? And so power flows out from the center. There's a centralized power. It's very what we'll call institutional in many respects, is a good example of modern power. Institutionalized power is modern power, right? It flows outward from the center, sort of like top outward. It's very much like a patriarchal system, if not a semi-patriarchal system, right? When postmodernity comes around, it's very interested in those on the margins. It's very interested, much like the people in the 1800s who are like, they're concerned about the slaves, those on the margins, the women, those on the margins, right? What we start to see in postmodernity is an intellectual shift that accepts marginalized voices to be, in many respects, more than the voices at the top or the center. And so what we see is we have a rise of an exploration of these marginalized voices and manifests in things like African American studies or women's studies in college. Now, here's where things really start to get interesting because I want to start talking about a feminist understanding of power that basically comes out of this new environment. Um, just one second. Let me grab a few years back, I came across this book by Peggy Chen called Peace and Power. I don't know. I hope you can see it. Get the glare off there. There you go. Peace and Power. It's show and tell time. Yay. Okay. So we've got Peace and Power. And that was it's a small book, but it had a significant effect on me because what she ends up doing is she starts talking about two different understandings of approaches to power. And one is that hierarchical understanding of power that flows top down. It's basically the dominance hierarchy, right? And she's the one who identified this as sort of a patriarchal power. This is a patriarchal system. But another version she points out has been developed by feminists, and that is a horizontal version of power. Okay? Now, here, power is shared. Power is derived from things like shared values. Okay. So this is the type of this is the type of power that doesn't ask more of another than they can give. It doesn't make decisions with complete disregard to the other. It's very interested in their voice and their perspective and how it's going to affect them. So what we see is a completely different understanding of what it means to exercise power within human life. And and the way that she describes this is, that it's a non-coercive power with. So we've got patriarchal power over, and we've got what I'm going to call the feminist horizontal power with. Okay. Now, and here's the thing. When we look at our society today, what what I think we're seeing here is that we have a cultural term for this power with. It's a very common cultural term for power with. Um, and everybody knows it almost instinctively who's used to working within the system and recognizes it. But the name for that power with culturally is love. And that, I argue, is the genius of this feminist vision of power with. I believe what they've done is ultimately they've broken out love from the patriarchal, hierarchical paradigm and separated it from that. No longer is it entwined with the dynamics of a power that flows downhill. Now it is separated from that. So no longer can we see love as a necessary aspect of that structure, but now we actually see it as contrary to any domination system. In fact, to the point where we see that a lot of people are like, the way of dominance is the way of not love. Now, think for a minute about the significance of that. Okay. Up until recently, the dynamic that we call love was entwined with and inseparable from a patriarchal structure. And for the first time in human history, love is now something completely different. Now, I realize that in our society, not everybody sees love and equates it with power with. Many still lean into this idea that love is a part of power over, or power over is still part of love or an expression of love. And that's kind of my point. We are literally witnessing the transformation of love itself right before our eyes. So now, here's the stuff that I'm most interested in because I want to interpret this theologically. God is love. That to me is the ultimate proclamation of the gospel. That is the revelation that God is love. And when we see love evolving and love transforming into something new, what we're really witnessing is the evolution of God. God is becoming more than God has ever been before. And that, I believe, is why Christianity is struggling so much right now. This is, I believe, the number one reason why we find ourselves in this huge crisis. Because if the God who is love is evolving and transforming into something new, what does that mean for us as a people who proclaim that God is love? How do we participate in this divine metamorphosis? What does it mean for our world? And so that's what I see happening right now. And those are the questions that I've been wrestling with recently. And now, hopefully, the title of this chat makes sense. The Feminist Jailbreak that liberated God from her patriarchal prison cell to become more than she had ever been before. Now, all that said, I want to emphasize you can take this all with a grain of salt because I am but a finite being trying to perceive the infinite. But at the same time, I think that if I'm right, this is part of what's fascinating to me. What we are seeing is that God is transfiguring from a he to a she, right? Because we could talk about God as he in the past because it makes sense within a patriarchal structure to talk about God as he because that's that's how patriarchal structures are typically aligned with he is on top, right? Even if you have matriarchies, still for the most part it's a male dominated thing, even though it's actually more than that, right? The image that makes sense is he in that patriarchal structure. But in this postmodern paradigm, a paradigm in which we see that the dynamic of love is moving from masculine to feminine, we can argue that God's self, is transforming from the masculine to the feminine. And that it is perhaps, if it was most appropriate to talk about God as he in the past, today it is most appropriate perhaps to talk about God as she. So that's just something to kind of throw out there. Um, and that's really all I have for today. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's made you think a bit. I hope that it has maybe inspired new questions. If you have thoughts or feedback, I would love to hear that. Let's turn it all over to you all. And I'm going to get a drink because I got to get a drink. So go ahead and pop anything you want to say in the chat. Let's see. Do I try to reconcile my intuition with scripture? Um, well, the difficulty with that would be this. Scripture was written in a patriarchal system. So the whole idea that, uh, excuse me, the whole idea of what I'm talking about is it would be a new development in history as opposed to something that they could conceive of back then. Now, that being said, I would argue that there are elements of it. It's not like a purely one-sided thing. It's not necessarily like an either-or thing. It's what I'm going to call the dominant paradigm. Okay, so for example, when you say talking about God as Lord, okay, very patriarchal, very top down. When we look at the imagery and such like that in Scripture, a lot of the language that we see in the Christian Testament is drawn from things like patron-client relationships. Okay, now remember if you've got a patron, you've got a client. The client serves the patron, and a client is considered faithful in as much as the client is able to represent in themselves and embody the will of the patron in the dealings when they're representing the patron. So that itself would be sort of like an example of a very patriarchal understanding of things. Um, so would that mean God has evolved or that we understand who? I'm going to argue that God has evolved. This is God evolving. Because for me, love, I take an approach that is from more radical theology. So for me, remember radical theology is sometimes known as death of God theology. Okay. Um, uh, and so when we look at God, for me, when I say God is love, that means God is like a way of being in the world. Like God symbolizes this way of being, this pattern of being in the world. And in a sense, in a pattern, the neat thing about a pattern is that it's not that patterns exist somewhere out there, but rather that patterns manifest in reality. And so love then is a relational reality in which one is pouring out oneself into the other for the sake of the other. Another word for this could be kenosis, right? One's pouring out oneself into the other for the sake of the other. That is that dynamic, the pattern of love. Okay. And so the patterns, like again, they manifest in this world, and that's what they are in their manifestations. When we see that the pattern is manifesting differently, it's becoming something new. That's the way I look at that. So, and we look at God as love. When love, the dynamic and what it means to love changes, then God is changing, is the way I look at that. I don't know if that answers the question. Oh, good. I actually made sense for once in my life. Yay! There's a first time for everything. Thank you, RJB. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with that. So, and that's probably the most controversial part of all this because I do want to argue that this is God evolving, right? Right before our very eyes, and that's the crisis. That's the crisis that we're dealing with. I mean, what happens when because you get stuck, and this is where we get into tradition and traditionalism. We talk about tradition as the living faith of the dead, and traditionalism as the dead faith of the living. In other words, it gets ossified, it gets stuck, and it can't move. And so when we see it's like God moving, if you will, and you're stuck, you're going to get left behind. No pun intended, just happens to be, right? And so you get left behind and you no longer represent or incarnate, if you will, that the image of God, because the image of God has changed. And so if we want Christianity to reflect a God who is love, that requires Christianity as a tradition to evolve as well into something new, to transfigure into something new. Any other questions out there? Oh, hello, Eric. Welcome. Unfortunately, sorry to tell you this, but we're actually closing down. But if you have questions, throw them out there too. Except, can you please start over? That's not necessarily the best because it would take a long time. But there will be a replay going out so watch your inbox for the replay. Um, any other questions from anyone? Grab it, ring. If you don't have any questions, then I'll tell you what. I said I wanted to keep these relatively short in order to honor everybody else's time and recognize that you all have busy lives. And I appreciate each and every one of you for showing up. Thank you very much. And if you are out there listening to the replay and you've gotten all the way to this part, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to watch this replay. And I hope that somehow you've not only have you enjoyed this, but I hope somehow it has inspired new questions for you in your life that are calling you then to move beyond who you are right now. But as I wrap up, in case you don't know who I am, Bo McGuffee, religious, reasonable, and radical. I would recommend to go ahead and sign up for my Substack. And I will do this probably weekly. I will have other things throughout the week. And until next time, and thank you very much, RJB. Till next time, peace.